Thank you very much, Jensen-san. It is very informative and inclusive presentation. Actually, we got several questions from the audience, so I'd like to take some questions. I will read in Japanese, so maybe it will be translated.
Yeah, I can see them.
Yeah. Okay. Our first one is that
involved in the implementation of cybersecurity-related TDX in the past, and while it is true that games are an excellent way to understand the impact of each player's decisions and risk assessment in complex systems, in order to achieve such effects, I believe that the role of creating scenarios for the exercises and moderating and facilitating the progress of the exercise is most important. However, in order to achieve such effectiveness, the role of facilitating and moderating the exercises of utmost importance. What qualifies the experience or qualities and experience are required of these professionals? Does military experience fall into that category?
This is a brilliant question. And whoever answered question one, when I come to Japan, let me buy you a delicious whiskey and we can talk about this at length. Because this is you've hit on something very important. If games are about modeling a series of interesting decisions, it's not just enough to have rules or the right scenario and the right players. It's about humanity. And it's about having people who have a high enough emotional intelligence that they can read the room. They can actually figure out when someone is, I joke in the US, and this is probably less of a problem in Japan. Sometimes we have what I call peacocks. They just want to show their feathers and show you how important they are. And if you're not careful, they will distract the conversation and limit everyone's voice. So you are spot on about the importance of facilitation. And I think the qualities and experiences required it's actually intangible. The best facilitators are empathetic. They try to understand people. They listen to them. Military experience, I've got it, and I think I'm a good facilitator. I get paid to do these games, but I don't think military experience necessarily translates automatically into good facilitation. In fact, I've watched a lot of people who are good at running a military war game really struggle to run a good business game because they're too authoritative. They try to impose too much order, and then the business official is looking at them like, I don't work for you. So I think actually the utmost quality you want is a balance between being very empathetic, listening, caring about the players, hearing them, but also confident enough to not let the players dominate anything. So it's a very kind of delicate balance between confidence and empathy that's, I think, actually intangible. So that's a phenomenal question. I don't know how you hire for that if you're looking to hire a game designer. You know.
Okay, Jason, thank you very much. And another question would be that 米国では経済安全保障やその他地政学に関するリスクに対応するために TTX を社内で実施している民間企業は増えてきているのでしょうか
Sorry, more and more private companies in the U.S. implementing the security and geopolitics. One, whether is it common to invite outside experts or more companies doing it in-house? And number two, what industries in what industries TTX is mainly conducted?
Yeah. So I'll start with the first one. Yes, it is increasingly common to run these games. And it's mixed, actually. So I'll give you an example. There was one very large company where the first game they did, they invited my team in to come build the game. But as part of the contract, they asked to videotape it. And so what they did is they had my team come in, lead a professional crisis simulation and game, and then they had professional teams videotape it. So then they could go to individual business units and rerun that scenario. And so that was a very creative way of doing that. Bring in outside expertise, but then you've already paid them, capture the video, and then run your own vignettes internally. So I think increasingly companies want outside folks to come in because they're worried that maybe biased internally on what they do. And so sometimes it's helpful to have a fresh set of eyes. Now, the challenge whenever you're an outsider coming in to build a game is it takes a lot of time and energy to really do the research to understand their business, their concerns. And so the thing that makes your game credible is the amount of research and the amount of time you've spent getting to know the employees, the key decision makers. And so even though you're an outsider, you're kind of like a cousin. You're not the brother, you're not the sister, but you're kind of in the family. And usually you've had access to proprietary information. And so yes, companies are increasingly doing it. And yes, they involve outsiders. But even when they involve outsiders, it only works if the outsider kind of becomes an insider and then even creates a product that can be reused across the company. And then the second part of that question, in what industries are TTX mainly conducted? It is wildly varied in my experience. So I've done them from retail companies, I've done them from food companies, I've done them for financial companies, I've done them for energy companies. I think it's less about the type of industry and more about either the size. So a small company is not going to, even though I'm honestly not that expensive, but a small company is not necessarily going to think, I want to hire, a goofy guy like Dr. Jensen to come run a game. It usually is a certain size a company gets to, and it can vary. It's not necessarily you have to be billions of dollars in revenue a year to do it. I've done it for companies who have a couple $100 million in revenue a year. So there's a certain size. And then the real critical factor for them goes back to that question of uncertainty. If you are a domestic company that only ever deals with like a few customers and you've had the same customers for decades, you're probably not going to want to do a game. Again, you assume you can extrapolate or forecast to make predictions about your future business environment. So usually the factor is less about sector and more about degrees of uncertainty they assess in their business practices. And that's why, especially increasingly, energy, anything right now that deals with global supply chains, big interest in the games, and geopolitical risk, big interest in the games.
Yeah, Jensen, thank you very much. Actually, there we got a lot of questions. Okay. Another one is that
For Japan today, I believe that there is a difference in judgment and principle of action between the experts, as U.S. behavior is commonly referred to, and the leader, Trump. If we assume that there is a divergence between the top management and some sense of common sense within the other organization, how should we define other players in the game?
So, look, I'm an American and I still serve in our armed forces. So I know our politics can cause a lot of concern and shock around the world at times. But I would say this, that's actually the perfect time to do a game. In fact, the most demand I've had for my services are usually when an official that no one knows what they're going to do is elected, meaning that it creates uncertainty. Now, uncertainty creates also opportunity. So this could be a bargaining tactic, but you don't really think about it in terms of like, what's Trump going to do versus the US government versus US companies. I think you have to assess your business and assess your environment and say, if you think that the election of the new US president, who'll be inaugurated now in 4 days, creates more uncertainty, perfect time for a game. And because it allows you to think about how uncertain or how unpredictable. In fact, one of the best red teaming techniques to fold into games is a pre-mortem. And a pre-mortem is a technique where you assume failure. And so whatever your business or economic security concern is, you say, hey, I think it went wrong. And then you imagine how it went wrong. And then you can actually make multiple trajectories based upon degrees of political risk, whether that's a particular decision President Trump will or won't make, some domestic political dispute in the US, or things that we just necessarily don't see coming. President Trudeau steps down, crazier domestic security crackdown in China. So all those intangibles are right for gaming. Go to 4.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another question would be that
Such PTX not for security but for disasters and oil shocks, it could be meaningful. Are there any governments that are successfully using TTX? And if there are any available reports, please let us know.
Oh, okay. That's a different question. I was looking at what industry.
sorry. Actually, another one was the other one is a little bit the same question about the before.
Oh, okay. I'll start with 4.
Okay.
It sounds like number 4 wants me to build a game for them right now. So what types of industries and scenarios, like I mentioned, it's wildly varied. And usually the scenarios vary from kind of what I call slow burn. So cyber espionage, elite capture, corruption, long-term manipulation of financial markets, that tend to change the composition of business sectors and then push political pressure, so slow burn, or sudden shocks, geopolitical event. China invades Taiwan. The Iranian government collapses. The Venezuelan government collapses. The US doesn't do 20% tariffs. We go for 50% on everyone. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but just giving you examples. So one category looks at those kind of slow, gradual, which actually sometimes are harder, those slow, gradual events that emerge versus sudden shocks. And again, the US companies implementing TTX to think about economic security wildly varied. Again, I've done it with financial companies, economic companies, telecommunications companies. In fact, one of the most interesting activities I just finished was helping a mix of companies and government officials stress test national resilience strategy. So working with the outgoing administration, President Biden's National Security Council, to actually think about what a national resilience strategy would look like. And we actually used a series of actual case studies. So we forced people, we did actually a historical counterfactual. We forced people back into the past to relive particular crisis moments and use those decisions on the historical case to imagine future. So we used a domestic terrorist event that took out a major telecom provider in the US. We used some major cyber incidents I won't get into. And then we used the Francis Key Scott Bridge. So just a natural accident no one could see coming. A major shipping tanker hit a bridge and then shut down large transits around Baltimore. So we used those events, completely accidental, domestic terrorist, more great power competition based, to then analyze how it changed questions about national resilience. And what is the framework per individual company, results, challenges? I don't think we have time to get into all of that. And frankly, I signed a legal obligation with each of them to keep their specifics confidential. So I think it's probably best we move to number 5. Yes, outside of security, human security, let's talk about it. So question 5, I believe that such a TTX can be applied not only security, but to other areas such as disasters and oil shocks. Are there any governments that are successfully using TTXs? Is there any publicly available reports? Please let us know. I listed all my reports in the slides. So if the organization hosting tonight shares the slides, you can click on them. At least half of those games don't deal just with direct security challenges. And in fact, a lot of more interesting games I've done were dealing with human security concerns helping ECOWAS in West Africa. So energy markets are one of my favorite things to model because a lot of times oil shocks can be a function, or any shock, whether it's natural gas, oil, even intermediate resources required for certain types of renewables. There's all sorts of reasons that can cause a shock. And so again, a game is a series of interesting decisions. It's modeling how people respond to those shocks. So I just encourage you to look through some of those studies we did, and then I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Okay, Jason, thank you very much for taking out of the time for around 5 minutes or something. Yeah, thank you so much. It's very helpful for the listeners. Okay, now it's time to close the webinar today. Thank you again for today's for our lectures, Dr. Jensen. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your participation in our BBL webinar today. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Jensen-san.